Good evening, everyone. Good evening, or whatever time it happens to be for you when you're tuning in or watching this. I'm Grimm's Lawyer, and this is Conlang with me, number 7. So, I'm going to go ahead and start with a quick review of where we're at. And I'm just going to mostly use the agenda sheet here as the guide as we review, just because it's been 6 sessions already. So far we have our goals, and my goals with this Conlang are written out here. I wanted to focus on being able to express concepts in the humanities and social sciences, particularly history, linguistics, and anthropology, and these other ones listed here, in a detailed and compact way. And I want it to be something that I personally enjoy. And if other people like it and want to use it, then they are also welcome to, once I have documentation on this language. So we started with that and talked about a few features I knew I wanted, which were the not minimalistic and the sort of fusional and easy to derive parts of speech. But these have kind of shuffled around as we've gone through the different goals. And then we talked about noun classes. So this language is going to have noun classes. Between 8 and 10, I've kind of gone up and down in terms of how many I'm going to have, but I'm going to have some noun classes. We talked about the noun number, which is a default collective or mass, and a marked count or singulative system, which you can see the explanation of in the recording of session 3. Then we talked about verbs and how my verbs are going to work. We're going to have 2 moods, realis and irrealis moods, and 2, ultimately, we've changed this. I've changed it a bit so that we have 2 aspects, perfective and imperfective, and we have 2 evidentialities in the realis, a direct, which also covers primary sources, if I have primary source documents, and an indirect for secondary sources, or information that is not directly obtained from the primary source. And I talked about the alignment, and we have a fluid S active stative alignment in this language. The ditransitive alignment is indirective, so there's a dative case that marks indirect objects. And then I talked about semantic relations. I have 7 overall cases, with the patientive case being unmarked, all the other ones marked in some way, which we haven't entirely determined yet. Then we talked about the typology of the language, how it's going to be broken up, how fusional or agglutinative it will be, and this is still kind of in flux. It's going to actually depend a lot on some of the discussions we have tonight. Then I talked about the pronouns that I'm going to have. And we talked about adjectives for a while, and I determined that adjectives are going to basically be verbs in this language, stative verbs, and the way that you use adjectives is you're basically having a relative clause describing the noun. We talked about adjective clauses. We also talked about noun clauses. And then last time, we talked about coordination, the coordinated conjunctions a bit. We didn't go super in-depth. We talked a bit about the concept of and or and but and how those can work, or at least how I would like those to work in this language. Just a very cursory, quick thing that we did there. And we tested out some of the syntax stuff that we had determined from all of this discussion in the prior session. And then we kind of went over adjectives, nouns, and verbs one last time. I talked about some of the changes I had made, and that is how we ended the last Conlang with me. So today, I am going to kind of proceed to talk about discourse, the sort of pragmatic, some general pragmatic things I want to think about in this Conlang, which is going to be a bit different than it has tended to be in my Conlangs recently, just because of how different the goal of this Conlang is. And then once we get through that, I'm hoping to also get to sourcing of the language. We talked a bit in session, I think it was session 4, about whether or not this Conlang was going to be a priori or a posteriori, and I said I was not ready to think about that because I wanted to get more of this grammar stuff thought about. But I think now is the time to finally get to that decision, or be thinking about that decision. So that is my plan for today. So that is a review done. And we're going to go ahead and start talking about discourse. So, discourse. So what you see are these two guys here, and I'll explain why they're here. I'm just going to give a brief overview of some of the pragmatic stuff I wanted to talk about. This is by no means a pragmatics course, and it's not going to explain everything that comes into play with pragmatics. There are so many different topics that could be covered here, but I specifically want to think about the speech acts that are going to be going on in this language. Now, I say speech acts because that is the general term that's used by a lot of linguists when discussing languages. This language seems to be like it's mostly going to be written. It could be spoken by me, or read by me at least, but it's mostly going to be written. So that's going to change some of this a bit, quite a bit. But I still want to think about it, because I like to think about it when I make my conlangs, and part of the point of this conlang with me is kind of explain my process in making a conlang. So, I just want to talk about two different ways, two different models that exist to think about speech acts, and they're not conflicting models per se, they're just a bit different. And I tend to think about conlang speech acts in this with both of these models because these are the ones that I am most familiar with. Just based on my education in linguistics, these are just the ones I'm most familiar with and most comfortable talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about why these guys are here. So Roman Jakobson, he is a very well-known figure in linguistics in a lot of different domains of linguistics, in fact. In particular, he's known for formulating, among many other things in linguistics, the idea of these communicative functions. They were usually called just the 6 functions of a language. That's what they tend to be called in the literature, but sometimes they're called communicative functions, or communication functions, actually. Communicative functions, or communication functions, this is a way of modeling discourse based on 6 factors, and how the function, like which factor the function focuses on, the function of the language. So when you're communicating, there are a bunch of different factors at play in Jakobson's view, or his formulation of pragmatics. So there are these 6 factors that I have listed here. We've got the context, and context is what it sounds like it means. It's just the context around what you're speaking about. It's like the topic, your environment can be the context, and just the subject matter that you happen to be talking about and your environment. Both of those can be involved in context. So that's the first factor. Then we have the message. The message is what is actually said, like what language is expressed, what sentences, clauses, words, etc. are used. So that's the second factor. we've got these two interlocutors, people speaking. We've got the addresser, who is the speaker, and we've got the addressee. This is who they're talking to. And of course, these can be singular or plural. You can have multiple addressers and multiple addressees, but they're just roles in communication. So we've got addresser and addressee. Then we've got contact or channel. And the contact or channel is how you are communicating, like the means of communication. So is it in person? Are you on the phone? Are you sending a telegram or a letter? Are you writing something down for people to read later? That's sort of the contact. And then the code is sort of the meta of language, and that's why this is metalingual. I'll explain the functions in just a moment. But the code is the language itself. How is that different from message, though? Message are the words or phrases that you say. Code is the concept of the message, which I think will be clearer once we talk about the functions. So those are those 6 factors. So the context that you're in and that you're talking about, the message itself, the language that is spoken, like the words that are spoken, the person speaking, the person to whom they're speaking, what sort of your means of communicating is, and then the fact that you are speaking, I guess, is what we can say code is here. And so what he determined is that language can have 6 functions depending on what focus that they have in terms of these factors. So the referential function, in Jakobson's view, is the focus on the context, either the topic that you're talking about. So it's just referring to a topic, whatever you happen to be discussing, or it is referring to your immediate context. So deictic functions like pronouns or referring to your surroundings would also be typically referential. So mostly these are going to be running up against sort of truth. You're asserting things or saying things. We'll get into whether you're asserting things or not when we get into this other model here with John L. Austin. But referential is just, the majority of straightforward discussing topics. You're referring to a topic or your immediate surroundings. Poetic, the poetic function of language, is one that focuses on the message for its own sake. So words for their own sake. Your focus is on how you use the language. So this would be things like poetry, or maybe song, like lyrics in a song. The language is for its own sake. There might be some referential stuff built in and some other things like emotive, but the point is the message itself. Slogans are also often considered poetic in sort of this communicative functions model, because there's a focus on the message itself, the message for its own sake, rather than to convey some kind of information about the content. Emotive, so the emotive function, it relates most to the sender or the addresser. So these are things like interjections, like whoa, or ouch. A lot of interjections are going to be, they have an emotive function linguistically. They're just purely there to get the addresser's emotions across. Then there is the conative function. The conative function is about the addressee. So when you speak with, when your language has a conative function, what it is it is either just purely getting the listener's attention, or asking them to do something. So imperatives would fall under the conative function. in Jakobson's model, because it's focused on the addressee, getting their attention, telling them to do something. Then we have the phatic function, and the phatic function is about the contact, how you are communicating with each other, and even just the fact that you're communicating with each other. So things like trying to establish that you are having a conversation in the first place. Like, say you are on the phone with someone, before they answer the phone, you might say hello. You're trying to say hello, like, we're about to speak, let's establish a contact. Let's try to make sure we're contacting each other. Or if you mishear someone, you might ask them to repeat themselves. You're trying to re-establish the channel of communication with a phatic function. Discussing like sort of casual greetings tend to fall into the phatic function. You're just trying to make a connection with someone. You're not really conveying any information that's of substance. Things like discussing the weather or asking someone how they are when you don't actually want them to tell you how they're doing. You're just trying to communicate purely for the sake of the contact with the other person, establishing a channel to maybe then move into a different kind of discussion that talks about something. So that is the phatic function. And then we have the metalingual function. And this is where we get into why code is kind of confusing. But metalingual communication is any communication about language, basically. If you were talking about the fact that someone uses nouns or verbs, or discuss the grammar someone just used, that your language has a metalingual function. A lot of people tend to just group this into a kind of referential. It's just what you're referring to is the language itself. But Jakobson thought that this was its own unique kind of function. Some people call this sort of reflexive, in that it's language referring back to itself. But this is how Jakobson thought of it, as a separate category. So those are the communicative functions. And when I'm making a conlang, I tend to, at least partially, think about these things, or have them in the back of my mind as I am thinking about the language a bit, like how I want to use it. Now with this language, as I'm thinking about how I want to use this language, there are a few things that stand out to me with my goals. One is that the conative and phatic functions seem less likely to occur in this language. I'm mostly taking notes on or expressing information or recording information on humanities topics. And so the person I'm communicating to mostly is myself, my future self. Now, of course, if other people use this language or want to learn this language, then this is still something I need to maybe think about. But they don't seem like they're going to be that common at the very least. Won't be trying to establish channels of communication. It's just sort of my writing is how I'm communicating. I don't need to check that my writing exists. That might happen, but it seems less important. And the conative function, I'm not going to be giving a lot of commands to people in this language. I have an irrealis mood to talk about hypotheticals, and in the event that I am making a command, I would probably use the irrealis mood for that. But I don't really have a lot of addressees that I'm going to try to be getting the attention of with this language. So these seem like less important functions. So I'm going to just italicize them a bit, just to say that maybe these are going to be less distinct. Metalingual seems very important. I'm going to be talking about linguistics. So discussing the language itself as I use it, I would like to have vocabulary in this language about this language. So I think this will probably be important. So I'm going to underline that. Emotive, probably less so. I am going to need to talk about emotions as I get into psychology stuff and cultural stuff. So I will definitely have a vocabulary for emotions themselves, if in the context of emotions, but emotives where I'm expressing things like my experience while writing the information, that might be useful to contextualize what I'm taking notes on. Like, I took these notes while I was in a rush or something like that. Might be useful information, but I might think about, one thing I was thinking about is narrativity. I was thinking about whether or not I wanted narrativity in any way. I think I discussed this a little bit in my review of verbs in session 3. I don't remember if I did actually, but even if I didn't, narrativity I will discuss probably in another session when we get back into the verbs themselves. But basically it's about how unexpected something is. And that's maybe the kind of value judgment I don't want to be placing on my notes about a particular topic. Or maybe it is. I'll think about that more. I'll leave it unaltered for now. Poetic. Well, I guess part of the goal of this language is to just be pleasing to me and fun to me. So part of it is the message for its own sake. But I do actually want to use this language for its function to refer to information about the topics I intend to use this language for. But maybe to an extent, poetic could come into play if I'm going to be wanting to use this language poetically. I'll kind of leave that unaltered too, but I know I want to be doing reference. I'm going to be referencing things a lot, and I know that this language is going to refer to language a lot, so it will have that kind of reflexive function. Alright, so that's sort of one way of thinking about discourse, or communication in language. Another model, which was put together by a lot of linguists, but John L. Austin is often credited with putting this theory together initially, it's been largely expanded upon by other linguists, is the concept of Speech Act theory. And so I'm going to sort of unveil this a bit. I don't want it to be distracting to have too much text on the page. But Speech Act theory is the idea that when we are communicating, we might be doing different speech acts. Some linguists consider speech acts a very particular and limited kind of use of language. But in Austin's theory, pretty much all language can be categorized into some kind of speech act. So, what are the different speech acts? So, he came up with 6 kinds of speech acts, interestingly enough. It's 6 again, just like there were 6 functions of language for Jakobson, but they don't map perfectly to Jakobson's functions. This is kind of a different framework. So, the way that Austin separated these speech acts were into representative, commissive, declaration, directive, expressive, and verdictive. Oh, this one's still plural. I wanted them all to be singular. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly explain what these are. Representative is pretty close to Jakobson's idea of a referential. You are just representing information, forming hypotheses, making statements or claims. The majority of what I will be doing is representative. This is pretty close to referential. Then we have a commissive speech act, which is anything that is committing oneself to future action. So this could be things like a promise. If you make a promise to someone, your action that you're taking by speaking is that you're committing yourself to a future thing that you're promising, an oath. You make a pledge or a vow, like a marriage vow would be commissive. You are committing. It's commissive. You're committing to something. The other thing I can think of that might fall into commissive, I think this is something Austin agreed with too. I'm pretty sure about this, is a threat. If you're threatening someone, you are also committing to a future action that you will take if, someone does not heed your threat. So those kinds of things, promises, and I guess a threat is kind of like a negative promise or a dangerous promise. That would all be commissive. It's a different kind of action than just conveying information or ideas, which is what representative is about. Commissive is about committing yourself to future action. Then we have a declaration. And a declaration is when the language, the communication or the language, has the job of declaring that something is the case that was not the case before. Declarations often change the sort of social reality of the context from what they were before. And let me explain a little bit more what I mean. A declaration is often what other linguists who don't kind of think in this framework call a speech act. They might only call what Austin calls declarations. They might call this what is a speech act. But Austin thought all of these were different kinds of speech acts, and declaration was just one of them. But I think giving an example would help with this. If someone has just given a marriage vow, they've just done a commissive speech act. They've just, vowed to marry the other person, and then that other person vows to marry them and, be with them for however long their marriage will last. That is those are commissive speech acts. They're committing themselves. They're making vows to each other for their lives. Then whoever is officiating will often say, "I now pronounce you married." And in that declaration, the sort of legal reality of the people has changed. They have gone from being legally unmarried to being married. So there's sort of a new social reality that has come about simply by those words being spoken. Until the officiant says that, they are not married. Once the officiant says that, they are married. So there are many other things that fall into this category. Any kind of language that changes someone's status. So if you fire someone, the act of saying you are fired is a declaration. They have gone from being employed to being unemployed with that speech act. Other things I can think of, like a sentence. If you sentence someone, or if a judge makes a, I guess we could say a declaration, that would be a declaration. A judge giving a sentence, or someone I'm trying to think of other examples. If you baptize someone, they've gone from being unbaptized to being baptized. So declarations change someone's status with regards to something. It's the language itself that changes their status. It is a declaration. So that is the act that you're taking part in by speaking. A directive. Directives are very similar to what Austin called a conative. Or not Austin, sorry, Jacobson. Austin called them directives. Basically, it does focus on the addressee in the sense that it is things like commands, orders, requests, anything that you're trying to tell the listener to do something. You are giving them a directive. You're giving them sort of a command. Or a request, you might be inviting someone to something. You might be summoning them. Or challenging them or daring them to something. daring them to do something. Those would all be directives. Commissive and declaration don't really have good analogs in Jakobson's model. I guess a commissive, when you're committing yourself to doing something, I don't know where I would put that in Jakobson's model. I think it might just be considered a type of referential for Jakobson. But a directive is pretty much what a conative is, a bit. It has a conative function to do a directive speech act. Then we have expressive. And expressive is a bit like Jakobson's emotive, where expressive is basically expressing the an emotional state. So it is a bit emotive, but you're expressing it with different language. So it could be something like an interjection, like emotives tend to be, or it could be offering condolences if someone has passed away or something bad has happened to someone. You might offer condolences. That speech act exists not to convey information per se. There's not like new info you're teaching them by speaking, or it's not a hypothetical thing you might be postulating. It's not a promise to do something. It's not changing the status of anything, and it's not a command. It's just expressing your feelings about something. Now, expressives can also kind of have a phatic function, in that they can be things like greeting someone, saying hello, or how are you, or have a good day. Like those kinds of things, you're expressing that you have goodwill towards the person. So that is the expressive speech act. Finally, we have verdictives. A verdictive is any language, any sort of speech act that is providing an assessment of a situation. This can be maybe a little bit difficult to distinguish from a declaration. For example, when I talked about a judge making a verdict, that's not a verdictive, that is actually a declaration, typically, because you are changing the legal status of the person by, declaring whether they're guilty or innocent or sentenced to whatever they're sentenced to. A verdictive is more just purely expressing the assessment rather than changing the actual reality. So a verdictive would be something like expressing how much or how little you like something. Maybe giving a ranking to something or a score. Let's say you watched a movie and you want to give it an 8 out of 10. That act of saying this movie was an 8 out of 10, that's a verdictive. You're kind of assessing the quality of something. You're not just purely giving information about the thing. You're not saying this is what the movie was like or this was what it was about. You're specifically giving it a value. If you say you approve or disapprove of something, that would also be a verdictive, like, I don't know about that, or I would try again. Those could be verdictives or have a verdictive. That would be a verdictive speech act. You're kind of evaluating or assessing something with your speech. So those are the sort of speech acts that Austin kind of put together and that have been further developed by different linguists who study pragmatics. Now, all of these levels, I want to think briefly about which ones I think will be most relevant in my language. Just like what I said with referential, I think representative is the main kind of speech act that I would be doing. And again, I will reiterate, speech act is just the term for it. I will probably not be speaking this language very often. I will mostly be writing it. But most of my writing will be representative of information that I'm taking down. I will not be doing a lot of committing myself to things. This isn't a language I plan on taking many personal notes to self in. I have other languages I use for that. So if it's like, I'm going to take notes on this later, that would be a commissive, but I probably wouldn't do that in this language. I might do it in English or whatever language I happen to be taking that sort of, writing that to do in. I also probably won't be changing any legal statuses or social statuses of anyone with this language. I might need to think about how to express those in this language, because I'm talking about social science and talking about, marriage, like legal status, things like that, might be relevant in this language. However, this language isn't going to be doing that. That would still be representative. I'd still be talking about the concept of it in a sort of meta-linguistic way. So, not super relevant in this language. I think neither of these are particularly relevant. I also, like I said with the cognitive, will not be giving a lot of directives. I won't be telling people to do things, including myself. Again, that sort of committing myself to something later, that's sort of, I have other languages I'd use that for. Expressive, expressing greetings, condolences, apologies, that kind of thing. I probably wouldn't be doing that very much. If other people want to use this language and want people to say hello and stuff to each other, I think it's still less likely to be used very often in this language, so it's not as important. Verdictives, assessments, appraisals. Won't be doing a lot of that in this language, I don't think, either. I'm not going to be judging the languages or cultures or much of the history that I take notes on here. I might have opinions on them, but that's not what this language is really for. Maybe if I have little marginal notes to myself about those things, and I want to use this language for it, that might be useful to say, like, this is how I feel about this thing. This is sort of my assessment of it. But I won't be doing that very often, so I also think this would be less essential, because both of these functions kind of fall into what, like, the kinds of speech acts Austin would call representative. So I think this makes sense that it would shake out like this for the language. I'll put these in the text, so I won't be doing much of that either. Alright, now the thing with these speech acts are, in Austin's theory, there are actually 3 different levels, speech act levels, that these operate on. Actually 4, but we'll get into the 4th in a bit. So, the 3 levels that Austin talk about are the locutionary level, the illocutionary level, and the perlocutionary level. So, and he calls these acts as well. So, an illocutionary, let's start with locution. The locutionary act is done when you speak an utterance or write an utterance, whatever communication you're using. The locution is basically the meaning of what you've said itself. Just its pure meaning. It's what you said. So if I say a sentence like, let's see. If I say a sentence such as, oh, hello, chat. I just saw someone say hello in the chat. Thank you. So, the first sort of level is the locutionary level of a speech act. So if you speak the locution of an utterance like, if I say, let me actually write this out, just to give an example. I'm actually going to insert a column as well. I'm going to make both of these columns kind of spaced out as well, so I have space to write. Alright, so if I say something like, oh, this is not enough space. Can you open the window? Oh, I know. I just actually need one that's really big. There we go. Can you open the window? The locutionary act that I have just done is I have asked a question. You can see by the question mark and the syntax, I've changed the word order. If I said you can open the window, that would just be a statement of fact. It would probably be representative of someone's ability to do something. It would be a referential function of language. I'm just referring to the fact that they can open the window. If I say, you can open the window, I'm just stating that they are able to. But with can you open a window, I've asked a question. On the locution level, I have asked a question. So it's a question. Can you open the window? So on the locutionary level, that's what I've done. However, then we get to the illocutionary level. So the illocutionary level is the level upon which you intend the statement to be understood. So how do you want the speech act to be understood? So if I say, can you open the window, I might be genuinely asking a question. Are you capable of opening the window? Maybe I haven't met you in person. I don't know whether that's something you're strong enough to do. I don't know about how strong your arms are or something. So I could be genuinely asking a question. But I could also be making a request indirectly. And typically when we ask questions like, can you open the window? Especially if there's a please in there, then we are actually illocutionarily making a request. We're telling someone that we want them to open the window. We haven't directly said that. We haven't said, open the window, or I want you to open the window. We've said, can you open the window? We've expressed it. The locution was a question. But oftentimes, more often than not, this kind of question is actually a request. We just haven't made it direct. We haven't said, open the window, please. That would be a bit more direct. The locution and the illocution would be the same there. But here, the locution is a question, but the illocution is a request. So that is the illocutionary level. Then we have the perlocution. The perlocutionary act is the actual effect of these two acts. So if in the act of saying, can you open the question, your locution was that it was a question. That's how they heard it. They understood that it was a request, maybe. And then the perlocutionary act is whether or not they actually do it. So if by making the request, if they then go, sure, I can, and then they go open the window, that means that you've convinced them. So your perlocution was, persuading them to open the window. That's your perlocution. So you said a question, you intended a request, and the outcome was that you have persuaded them. And there are lots of different kinds of perlocution. You can convince, inspire, frighten, threaten, different kinds of perlocution. But the difference here is the locution is, your literal what you say, what is the understanding of what your sentence is. The illocution is your intention, and the perlocution is the sort of linguistic result that comes about when you've had an interchange, a discourse between yourself and someone else. And you can be even more indirect with this. Can you open the window? Because it's about ability, it seems a little bit clearer that it's a request than other things. If I could say something like, it's getting stuffy in here. It's getting stuffy in here. That is a statement. So it might seem like you're just making a verdictive assessment of the quality of the air in the room. That's the locution. You've just made an assessment of the quality of the air. But you're probably, in so doing, potentially still wanting to persuade someone to open the window. You've just been more indirect about it. Your locution, the space between your locution and your illocution, the fact that you're making a request, is wider, even wider than it was before. And the perlocution might change. It might be the same. They might agree and say, yeah, you're right, I'll go open a window. In so doing, you have effectively made them open the window with your perlocutionary act. They might because you said it so indirectly, they might disagree. They might say, it's fine, and then you have failed to persuade them to open the window. So these are the different levels that these speech acts can operate on. So we have the representative, assertions or hypotheses, suggestions, commissives, which are, committing yourself to doing something like a promise or a pledge or a threat, declarations, which were the changing of someone's status by means of your speech, like declaring someone married or declaring someone guilty or innocent with your sentence. Directive, which is when you're telling someone to do something directly. Expressives, where you're just expressing your feelings about something, like giving condolences or congratulations or something like that. And then we have verdictives, which are assessments, and all of these can act on multiple levels. So this here, it's getting stuff in here, has representative illocution, locution, directive illocution. The perlocution tends to not really operate in with the same framework. It can be, the perlocution is just whatever the outcome is of your speech. So it could persuade someone, it could put someone off, it could distance someone from you. So that is the perlocution. Now the fourth thing that I mentioned before, the fourth possibility, is actually something called the metalocution. And all metalocution is, it's kind of like this metalingual, like referring to language itself, talking about nouns and verbs and things like that. Metalocution is when you're referring back to the discourse. It has the function of referring to the discourse itself. So if you are talking about someone's tone, that would be metalocution. That's sort of the effect of you speaking, is that it's about you speaking. You're assessing, and it might have a verdictive, right? You might be saying, you didn't express that in a very clear way, your tone was confusing. That would be verdictive metalocution. You're judging someone's communication. Or, talking about someone's, if you're grading someone's essay and they made some grammar mistakes or a typo or a punctuation error, that would be metalocutionary communication. So these are the kind of levels that the discourse can be analyzed at. Now with this language, kind of like what I've been doing here with the underlining of what will probably be most used, since this language is going to mostly be used to take down information about social studies topics, I don't think I'm going to be operating on multiple levels most of the time. Language always operates on multiple levels, but because this isn't meant, for the most part, unless people want to learn this language, to be used for communication between people, other than reading it, I guess, and mostly my locution will be representative, I would probably have my illocution also be representative. I just want to convey information for the information's sake. I don't have like an ulterior motive of asking someone for something or persuading someone of something. Maybe if I'm making an argument, if I have like a theory about something that happened in history or in language, I might have more of like a persuasive perlocution, potentially. That could happen. Or if I'm talking about a language and saying whether or not something is well formed in the language, maybe if it's sort of accurate to that language, I could be doing some verdictive metalocution if I'm analyzing a language with this language. But for the most part, I'm going to be mostly sticking to representative. I might do some persuading of opinion on a topic, but that is still sort of a focus on the context factor that we talked about earlier with Jakobsen. The context being the language or the culture or the historical event that I'm describing. So for the most part, I don't need to worry, I think, too much about this. In a lot of my conlangs, especially recently, I focused a lot on having this kind of information, which tends to be pretty opaque in spoken languages. Like you could see with English, you could ask something like, you could say something like, there's no or maybe, yeah, let's say there's no juice left in the fridge. This could have, like, so the locution is, it sounds representative, right? It sounds like you're just stating a fact that there's no juice left. But a lot of the time in English, this is something like, the illocution could be a request, right? Or even a command, like, go get some juice, is what this could mean. And that's a very big leap from, there's no juice left in the fridge, to go get some juice, which is kind of the effect the speaker wants this statement to have. And then the perlocution could be, I bought it last time, you get it, you know? They could react negatively to this indirect of a request, or they might say, oh yeah, I noticed, I'll go get some, in which case you've persuaded them to go get some juice, or, you've changed their actions with your speech. Languages tend to not, some languages have little markers for this kind of stuff, like what you intend to be your, the point of what you're saying, but most human languages are, at least to some degree, there's a difference, and that's why this whole framework exists. It comes from analyzing how languages work. Languages tend to have these multiple levels that statements are operating on. In a lot of my languages recently, I've tried to kind of narrow the gap in a lot of my conlangs so that sort of intentions are clear, and part of why I've tended to do that in a lot of my conlangs is I like to cut down on the opportunity for miscommunication about these kinds of things, because as you could see with some of those examples, you could be wrong in your assumption of what someone's illocution was based on their locution and how it sounded. Now, things like tone markers that some people use in their writing are one way to cut down on this, just to kind of say, like, I intended this, in a poetic way. I intended it as a joke for the sake of the message itself, or, I was being sarcastic, or, no, I meant this genuinely, I genuinely want you to do something for me, or I just am genuinely interested in sharing this information, it's not, an indirect request. So tone markers can be one way of cutting down on the sort of gap between locution, illocution, and perlocution. But most natural languages don't have this built in to themselves. So in a lot of my conlangs recently, I've gone kind of out of my way to think about this more deeply, because I want a lot of my conlangs that I've been working on to not have as wide of a gap with this, just to keep things clearer. Now with this language though, I mostly have one kind, or maybe two kinds, of speech act I'm going to want to be using the language for, which is just taking down information and recording it. So there's not a lot of opportunity for sort of difference between these things, unless I'm persuading someone of some kind of theory I have, in which case I might want to just indicate that. Now, when I think about this, I'm thinking about the fact that I have evidentiality in the language. My verbs mark for whether or not my information is coming from a primary source, which could be me, or it could come from a primary source document, or if it's from a secondary source, or if it's something that's hypothetical. So if I have a theory, that's actually already going to be marked on the verb. If I say, this thing might have occurred, and here's why I think so, then that gets across that I have a theory. Whether or not I'm trying to persuade someone of it might not be as clear. I could just be, that's not the right word. I could just be sort of, as an aside, throwing out the theory but not expecting anyone to agree with it. But that's going to be the case in most of my writing anyway. It's for me, for the most part, unless someone wants to go through the trouble of learning this conlang just to read my language notes. That's not going to be something I have to worry about. So I think I don't need anything built into the language, per se, that actually conveys this kind of information. Oh, question. How often do I think I'm going to use this conlang once it's done? Well, I think once it's at a stage where it's usable, I'm going to use it. I hopefully want to actually use it. That's one of my goals, is I want to make a language I can use, because lately I've been making conlangs and then just not using them, because I just either get distracted, or I get a different aesthetic that I want to try out and then kind of leave the other one behind, and it just goes into my library of many conlangs I've made. But I want to actually use this language for its intended purpose, which is to take notes on the kinds of topics I already like to research and look into. So, for example, if I'm preparing a session of yesterlore, for example, and I'm looking into maybe there's some facts about Anglo-Saxon culture I want to bring up if we're looking at Anglo-Saxon riddles, or, whatever it happens to be that we look at in yesterlore, I tend to have some notes on that kind of stuff. And right now, I'm mostly taking those notes in English or whatever language I'm thinking in at the time. Sometimes I take the notes in Old English, but my goal is to be able to use this language to take those kinds of notes. So as often as I will be doing research, hopefully, research that doesn't need to be read by someone. So, if I'm taking notes for a paper I'm going to write, the paper obviously is going to not be in the Conlang. But if it's just for me, if it's my notes, then I would like to use this language for it. So I guess as often as I'll be studying any of these topics, there's some stuff in psychology I'm getting really into studying recently. I'm not a huge psychology person. That's not sort of my field of expertise, but there's some stuff I've been doing research in recently. With a few different things I've been researching. I don't want to go into all of the stuff I'm researching right now, but one of the things I've been looking into is social psych stuff. And, there's lots of other topics I like to research. So as often as I'm going to be researching and taking notes on these things, that's how often I would like to be using this Conlang. So long as they're for myself. And that's a really good question. Thank you. Also, I had a question a few weeks ago where someone asked if other people were allowed to use this Conlang, and I said yes. So if other people use this Conlang and a community grows from it, I don't think that's likely to happen, but if that were to happen, then I would like to maybe be able to use this language with other people who are also maybe researching social sciences or humanities or something like that. Because I hope that this language will be kind of suited to those kinds of topics. So communication between scholars would be cool too. But that's not a key goal. I'm trying to keep this realistic for now. And realistically, I see myself using this language. I just really want this to actually happen. I want myself to make this language be very happy with it and want to use it a lot. So thank you. That's a very good question. When it comes to discourse, though, I don't think there's going to be, because this is between me and myself, and maybe potential other readers who want to read about these topics, and for some reason have chosen to do so in a Conlang. Maybe because they think it might express some of the information in a more compact and detailed way than it would be if it were in sort of like academic jargon or something. I mean, this language is kind of its own jargon. There is a barrier to entry, which it would be learning the language. But in the event that happens, it's still just communication about mostly information. The topics that are listed on the overview goals will be what I'll be talking about. And so there's some meta stuff there, metalingual, meta-locution, talking about communication if I'm talking about language. But if I'm just talking about history or anthropology or sociology, I'm not going to be making a lot of value judgments. I don't want to do that a lot. I don't want to just inject my own bias just because I'm the one writing. That's already going to be present based on what I'm focusing on. I don't want to add more just by saying whether or not I like something in a language or a culture. That doesn't seem very useful to me or to anyone. And there a lot of these kind of more interpersonal communication stuff, like getting someone's attention or establishing communication, talking about the weather with someone, don't seem particularly relevant. I will have ways to talk about those things, ideally, but that's not sort of something I need to worry about differentiating grammatically. So in sort of a departure from a lot of my recent Conlangs, where I've been really kind of building a lot of this stuff in to the grammar so that they're unavoidable and that you have to make it very clear what your intentions in speech are. My intentions are clear by the goal. The goal of this language is to communicate information. So I think my grammar sufficiently gets that across with the way that it focuses on evidence and hypotheticals, if those are being made. So I think that in and of itself makes my intentions clear enough. And that is, I guess, all I really have to say about Discourse. The only other thing I would do is ask if anyone in the chat has any questions about this stuff, because I know this can be very heady. I am myself not a huge expert in pragmatics. That's not the area of linguistics I really focused in a lot. But if anyone has questions about sort of these functions or speech acts, I can try to answer those questions. But if not, I think I might be ready to move on to, yeah, so these are some big terms. And I think the thing is, it's not super important that these terms be super understood if you want to understand speech act theory. I think the most important thing is just realizing that speech is more than just communicating information, that there are these other levels that we communicate on. We communicate information, that's just one kind of speech, right? Information about topics or about our context, but we also have all these other levels. How we're feeling about what we're saying, committing ourselves to doing something, even changing legal status. If we marry two people and pronounce them husband and wife, or husband and husband, or whatever that happens to be, that is language that is not just communicating, it's actually changing the reality. Giving commands, that's changing the reality around you. So language isn't just communication. This is something people say a lot, is like language, if they're trying to define language, they might say language is about communication. And communication is sort of what you're doing when you use language. But there are different kinds of communication. And I think that's the most important thing, is that there are just a lot of different levels that we use language on. And sometimes they're just trying to make contact with other people. Phatics like, hello, are you there? Like, can you hear me? Trying to just make a connection between people. And sometimes that's all language is there for. And sometimes it does very powerful things, like sentencing someone to a punishment or something. I think that's the most important takeaway, I guess, from this this concept of speech act theory, is our speaking can be action. It's just there are different kinds. And there are different levels that it operates on, and not everyone is going to immediately understand what you mean based on what you say, because language can be very opaque. So it's something to keep in mind. In terms of this Conlang, though, I think that is all I have to say on Discourse, which wasn't all that much, honestly. The discourse is pretty clear in this language for once. So I'm going to go ahead and move that aside. This tab. I have a lot of tabs now. I'm going to consolidate these for sure between some of the sessions to kind of beautify things and make them look better. So I think we can cross off Discourse from the agenda. We've had our discursion, as we might say, so we can move on to the next thing, which is something very exciting that I've been very apprehensive about, because I still don't know what I want to do with the sourcing. But I'm going to talk about it a bit. Discourse. Okay, yeah, the chat is appreciating my word, discursion. So before we get into this, and maybe it'll be a chance for people to take a look at this, I actually have to leave for about, let's say, a minute. So I will be right back. I'm going to write be right back somewhere here. Okay, Goofy the dog pronunciation of discussion. Hate the pun. Okay, maybe it wasn't appreciated, but it was taken in and absorbed at the very least. I wonder I wonder how we're going to understand what kind of communication that was. I think with the jokes, that would mostly be poetic. Yeah, so my communication, the function was poetic. I was just speaking for the sake of the message itself, making a pun. And the taking in that is happening in the chat, people are saying they hate the pun, screaming and throwing a fit. That would be a verdictive. You're making an assessment of something with your speech. The function of your communication is to judge, and judge harshly in this case. The communication I'm about to do is a eulogy for you. What kind of communication is that? A eulogy would be expressive, actually. Well, it depends on who's doing the eulogy and how sincere they're being, but expressive is things like expressing apologies, condolences, thanks. That's expressing your emotion to something. So a eulogy could be expressing, the loss that is felt by the person having died because they made a horrible pun and was attacked by the people in their chat. So that could be expressive. But often eulogies also have some representative value in sort of just giving information about the person. This person lived from this time to this time, and they did this in their life. This is how many family members they had. Eulogies often include that kind of information too. So there would be sort of a mix of representative and expressive there. If you say that person, had a positive impact on their community and, were a valued member of the community, that might be a verdictive. You're kind of judging their value, which is not necessarily a positive way to look at it, but it is something that can happen. In a eulogy, you could say, like, they will be missed. That's expressive, but maybe also verdictive, like this person had an impact on other people. You're kind of giving an assessment or an appraisal of the person. So yeah, I do need to leave. Actually, I think it's going to be more like 2 minutes. But I'll go to my be right back screen, actually. Thank you, chat, for hanging in there. It will indeed just be 2 minutes, so thank you. Alright, hello. It was a couple more minutes than I thought. I had to let someone into the building real quick. So, sorry about the delay, but we are back. Chat has been stewing in anger at my pun. I appreciate that. But we are going to go ahead and talk about sourcing. So, way back in session, I think it was 4, we talked about types of conlangs. And there are sort of two, there are more than 2 ways, but 2 of the main ways to think about types of conlangs are sort of like what the goal of the conlang is, which we determined this is an engineered language with some personal elements. Engineered for this sort of topic, personalized to my own perception of the topic, and aesthetic, still here, still doing perfect. Personalized to my also like just aesthetic preferences when it comes to using this language that I intend to use a lot. So that's thinking about the conlang in terms of its goals. But the other thing is thinking of conlang in terms of its source. And I sort of define what a posteriori and a priori mean. I'm going to redefine those real quick. And I actually made like a little pros cons sheet. I did not flesh this out entirely. I just put some stray thoughts. There's some redundancy here. And I plan on altering this a bit today. But let me sort of briefly describe what these mean. So, a posteriori, I'll start there. These are just Latin terms that we use to describe, linguists at least use these to describe words when they're discussing natural languages. And if something is a posteriori, if it is derived from another language. So, an example of an a posteriori conlang might be, let me think of an example. I'm trying to think of one that was done diachronically, but the main one that comes to my mind right now is Esperanto is a posteriori. It's based on a bunch of different languages, mostly Romance and Germanic languages. There's some Slavic influence in it as well, and even some non-European, but for the most part, Esperanto is based on European languages. But what makes it a posteriori is that there are actual, like, languages that existed before Esperanto did that went into the language. So if you look up a word in Esperanto, if you are looking at a good dictionary, it will tell you maybe what language or languages the word comes from. And there will be languages there like French or Spanish or Italian or German or Polish or whatever it happens to be. That's what makes it a posteriori. Now, Esperanto has existed for a very long time, and there are native speakers of it, so Esperanto is a little bit of a weird case, which is why I didn't want to jump to it. But it is a posteriori in that way. It's a particular kind of a posteriori, where you're taking from multiple sources and like kind of putting it together in one language. There are some things that are a bit a priori about the grammar, and I will talk about that when we get to a priori. But at least its words are a posteriori. Whoa, sorry. That was some noise there. Another example of an a posteriori language that's a bit different is the language, I think, I may be pronouncing this wrong, but I think it's called Venedic, which it was a language created by a Dutch, I don't remember if he was a linguist or just language was involved with his job somehow, but it's a conlang made by, I think his name was Jan van Steenbergen. I don't speak Dutch. He was Dutch. I don't speak Dutch, so I'm probably I don't speak Dutch, so I'm probably mispronouncing his name. I'll just write his name. I remember how it's spelled. Steenbergen. And I think the language is spelled like this. Venedic. and it is based on Latin, Vulgar Latin, so like the Proto-Romance that developed into the modern Romance languages, but with heavy influence from Polish or other West Slavic languages. It's what I called in session 4 when I was going over types of conlangs. It's called an alt-lang. It's based on an alternate timeline where there was a Romance language spoken in that area of Europe. So it's just developed from Latin, Vulgar Latin, into a conlang. So that's another example of an a posteriori language. So it's post, maybe that's the way to remember it, post another language. It's coming from an existing language. A priori is just the opposite of that. So priori is like before, so it's coming before another language. Doesn't make a ton of sense, but basically it's coming out of the conlanger's head entirely. So it wouldn't be being made based on the words in an existing language. So there can be elements of a posteriori language that are a priori. For example, Esperanto has a system where all nouns end in O, if I'm not mistaken, or oi if they're plural, and all adjectives end in a. I can't remember how accurate it is. I think they can also end in I if the nouns they are with are plural. I think the agreement is optional, though. I do not speak Esperanto, though, so people in the future, feel free to correct me if that is incorrect. I'm not a fluent Esperanto speaker. But while those kind of features are inspired by some things that natural languages do, the way that it's systematized like that is entirely sort of artificial. So some people might describe that as an a priori feature of the language, even though those kind of endings are influenced by real-world languages that could be called a posteriori. The way that it's put together is a priori. But a more purely a priori language might be something like Klingon. Klingon is meant to be spoken by the Klingon in Star Trek. This is another language I do not speak myself. But it's not meant to be derived from any human languages because it's not spoken by humans. It's spoken by the Klingon. So all of those words that were made by Mark Okrand, I believe he was the linguist who made that language, were just a priori. They just came out of his head. He might have been influenced slightly by existing languages, but he wasn't taking an existing language and deriving a new language out of it. He was just kind of making up the roots himself. A lot of David J. Peterson's languages, for example, the ones used in Game of Thrones, those are a priori because they're not from Earth. They wouldn't be speaking a descendant of Latin. So Dothraki, Valyrian, etc., those are a priori. Tolkien's languages, the Elvish languages, are a priori. Tolkien was influenced by sort of the phonesthetic of existing languages like Welsh or Finnish, but he wasn't straight up stealing words from them most of the time. There are some words where it's like, are you sure this doesn't come from an existing language you speak, Tolkien? But that can kind of happen subconsciously. There were at least no conscious, to our knowledge, choices where he's like taking a Welsh word and saying, this is just going to become the Elvish word for this thing. He made his own Proto-Elvish language with its own roots that then derive into the Elvish languages. So that's one thing a lot of a priori linguists will do, is they'll make a proto-language and diachronically produce a daughter language. So this is the diachronic approach that I mentioned in session 4. So when you make an a priori language, you could just make it directly out of your head and just say, like, this is how the language is, or you can make roots out of your head and then build your language like if it were a descendant from the root language that you kind of have sprung from your head. So you spring out the roots and the sort of structures, and then you then put it through naturalistic processes that real languages will take when changing, words and meanings, in order to make a language that feels, often the benefit of making a diachronic a priori language is it feels more naturalistic because it has gone through the kinds of changes that natural languages will go through, not sort of this artificial root sprung out of your head and just slapped together kind of thing. Of course, you can carefully put things together so they don't feel slapped together. Some linguists are very good at doing that. But the majority of linguists I know and conlangers I know who make a priori conlangs like the diachronic methods because it gives them more aesthetic and more natural sounding languages. When that's the goal, to make a language that sounds nice and that sounds realistic, the diachronic approach is, I think, a good approach. Now, my goal is not to make this language be the language for some kind of fantasy culture that I'm making, or fantasy history. I want to use this for history that's, that I happen to be studying, like real history. While I want the language to sound aesthetic and sound like it could be a spoken language, that's kind of just an aesthetic preference of mine, I am not overly concerned with it feeling like it has its own history and lore, at least not to an extreme extent to the way that I tend to do diachronic languages. That's sort of the overview of like the kinds of approaches that could be taken. Now, with this particular language, with my particular goal, I am making an engineered language. I want this language to be geared towards the goals that I have for it, the sort of humanities, communication, and documentation goal that I have with this conlang. So the question then becomes, which is the better approach? And what you see here is I already wrote some pros and cons to both approaches, making it, from my own brain, a priori, or deriving it from an existing language or existing languages, a posteriori. And what you can probably see, which might be a false impression just because I took these notes quickly and did not, finish really before the session because I thought that I would have more thoughts during the session, which is probably true. And maybe people in the chat might want to give their thoughts as well. But it looks like I think there are a lot more cons to the a priori approach for this particular language than pros. But that's probably just because this con has some sub notes here. So I'm just going to explain what I mean by these pros and cons that I have thus far, and I might rethink them a bit because I am by no means decided. I'm at a stage where I do not know what I want to do with, like, where am I getting my words from? Am I making them up? Am I making up roots and deriving from them? Am I choosing a natural language or multiple natural languages to derive my roots from? Am I going to take it entirely from a natural language, or am I going to do a mixed thing, where I might take roots from natural languages, but then work them into an a priori structure that I come up with that is not based on any natural language? That is a choice I have not made, and I'm hoping to make that decision tonight. That is sort of the main goal of this agenda item I have here, the agenda item that is sourcing. We've talked about discourse, and if I could just get through sourcing, I would feel happy. I would feel accomplished tonight. So we might get through more, but I'm just going to say, at the very least, I want to get through sourcing. So I want to explain my pros and cons for both of these, and then rethink them maybe, or think more deeply about them. Most of these are just pros and cons that I tend to think of in general when I make conlangs. I've made plenty of a priori languages, I've made plenty of a posteriori languages, so I don't have a particular preference as a conlanger for one or the other. For me, it really depends on the goals. But with this language, I really don't know what would be better for the goals. Maybe it would be good, actually, before I explain my pros and cons, to look at the goals. Actually, no, I'll explain my pros and cons, then we'll look at the goals again, and then think about this more deeply. So, for pros, for a priori, coming up with the language from scratch, not based on any existing languages. The pros that I wrote is that, the first one is that I have full control of morphemes. I can decide what a morpheme is, like what the root or the suffix or affix or whatever it happens to be, I can decide completely autonomously what I want things to be and what I want them to mean. Their range of meaning, their form, what they sound like. I would have full control of that. Nothing would be stopping me. Now, that could also be true of a posteriori, because I don't have to be married to whatever my source language is. I could take a source language and tweak it. Remember, it is possible to have a mix of these, so I want to keep that in mind. But with a priori, there's no even sort of slight feeling that I'm tweaking something from a language that I'm making a posteriori. I am the originator. I have the full control. I'm not at the mercy of the source. Even if I say I'm not going to care if I change something from the source, there still might be a part in the back of my mind where I'm like, this isn't exactly what the source is, and I might feel a little weird about that. With a priori, that's not an issue. And I could do very unnatural things easily. I can do something like have two concepts for very different things come from the same root because I want to draw a connection between those two things for the certain understanding of a particular topic in the humanities or social sciences. I could do something even if no natural language would ever do that. I could kind of have that liberty. Again, I could also just still do that in a posteriori, but there would be no even sort of slight reason why I wouldn't want to do that if it were a priori, because it's my Conlang. And it would be entirely 100% mine if it were a priori, which is all coming out of my head. And the other pro I wrote is that making new roots is fun. I enjoy making new roots. Sometimes I get into a rut where I'm like having sort of creative burnout and not able to think of anything creative or that sounds nice to me. That has happened. But there are options I have if that happens. There are things like tools like Awkwords, which is a website where you can put in your sound system and sort of the sort of restrictions that you have in your sound system, and it will spit out words that are valid in your language that you can then choose from. So I can like look at a list of potential, I just look at a scrambled list of potential words and say, I'm not feeling particularly creative today, but I will grab some of these that sound nice to me. I could always do that. So, but in general, I find the process fun. So it's just kind of a purely fun thing there. The other, I guess, pro, it's not really an inherent pro, but it is something I want to think about, is that most engineered languages, like Conlangs, that have been created and gotten a lot of wide recognition by a lot of other people, have been a priori. And it's because of their goal of, their engineering goal. They want to be unambiguous, or they want to be detailed, and natural languages aren't giving them what they want, so they might just go full a priori and not be restricted to that. Some examples of some engineered languages that are a priori might be Rho. There's this language called Rho. I don't remember the name of the linguist who made it. It was made quite a long time ago. But the idea of it was that every noun would be sort of a description of its categorization. So I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. I don't know this language. I just know of it and have looked into it before. But for example, you might have a root. Let's say you want to talk about like mint. So for mint, you'd start with like, there would be a root that means like living being. Then you might have the fact that it's a plant. Then you might have the fact that it's like a part of the plant, like a leaf. And then you might have the thing, always want to talk about mint, yes. I mean, it could be relevant to a particular culture, like their food or something. I also just enjoy mint. I just finished drinking some peppermint tea, so that's why it was in my mind. Me and the boys talking about mint again, yeah. That's right. And then you would have something, a mint-centric language. Maybe the next Conlang, because when I'm done with this Conlang, I think I'm going to do more Conlangs with me. Conlangs with me's. And maybe, what I think would be fun is if people in chat, like, kind of threw together ideas, and that the next Conlang with me was based on shared goals, and we could kind of collaborate on that. That could be fun. That could also get really hectic. Conlang with mint. Oh boy, yeah. One thing I have been thinking about is a T. This is totally off topic. A T language. I have in the past worked on something that I call Dolang, which was meant for baking. And basically the word for a particular pastry or like baked good was a recipe for how to make it. I might, like, a T language would also be cool. Maybe I'll do like a showcase on Dolang someday. I didn't finish it, and there were some other people who helped give me ideas for it. It wasn't entirely my brainchild. It was my idea, but other people chipped in. Other people who were interested in baking helped me with that. So I might want to talk to them first before I publish anything on it. But in any case, and I kind of want to start it over because I wasn't super happy with the results. But a T language might be fun. But we'll talk about future Conlang projects when we are sort of more done with this one. But anyway, the point is, row would sort of go into this, and then so you might have, you know, living thing, plant, leaf, mint, and then if you wanted to talk about maybe a different leaf, a different kind of leaf, the first three roots might be the same, but then you'd have a different next part. And so it was entirely engineered, like you'd have different roots. Now the criticism of row and engineered languages that look like this are A, that that's not super naturalistic, and B, that it can be confusing, because words for similar things sound similar, and while at first glance that might seem like a pro, it's actually a con for a lot of like language acquisition purposes. It would be really easy to confuse concepts that you need to differentiate between, that are like similar to each other but distinct. It would be easy to mix those up in your head. That is sort of the con that these kind of languages that these kinds of languages have. A conlang, yes. It would be a con. But the reason I'm putting engineered language here is because engineered languages, the ones that have seen success, have tended to be a priori because they're not constrained in any way by their source language. Another example that comes to mind is Ithquil. Ithquil, by some metrics, is an engineered language. It's very philosophical, so it's like a philosophical engineered language. But it is, it's a priori, based on like unique roots and structured in a unique way, where you are sort of building the meaning by combining different things. And there are a lot of people very interested in Ithquil, and Ithquil is a really interesting language. Engineered languages tend to be a priori. So this is just something, I'm putting it in the pros, not because it's an inherent pro. I don't have to do what everyone else does. I don't have to do that. It's my Conlang, just because everyone else who does engineered languages, not everyone, but a lot of other people who do engineered languages like them to be a priori, doesn't mean I have to. But I might find that I want to. The cons that I've written here, I'm going to explain. First, I wrote a greater cognitive load. And what I mean is, I really do want to use this language fairly often. And if I use it often enough, I would probably be able to learn it. But I don't want myself to have to put in too much effort in getting proficient in this language, considering how quickly I want to implement it. Learning any language, even one that you make yourself, takes time to learn. I've experienced that myself. It took me some considerable effort to learn some of the Conlangs that I've made that I speak. And there aren't a lot of them, because I haven't given most of the Conlangs that I've made a lot of time learning. There are only a couple that I've made of the many I've made that I actually can speak with some level of proficiency. If I make the language a priori, it would be a greater cognitive load for me to learn it. And part of the reason for that is that it's all new roots and affixes, etc. There's no connection I can make with known languages. If it's not connected to a language that I speak, I'll have to make new connections with like the concept and the sound, or the writing in the case of the fact that I'm going to be mostly writing this language. It'll have to be all new. So that's a con that I would have to like put in the effort to learn, like, oh, this is what this root means, this is what this derivative of that root means. And there's like nothing to grasp at in terms of my familiar languages that I'm aware of and that I've learned. So that is one potential con, the cognitive load. And the other con is that it's more of a workload. So this is kind of the flip side of that. Making new roots is fun. Making new roots also takes some time, right? It takes time to think of like, ooh, what do I want the root for person to be, and what derivatives do I want it to have. Now, taking words from existing languages can also take time. It's not like one is inherently more time than the other, but in my experience, I've taken a lot more time with making roots from scratch and then deriving from them or putting them together, because I've also had to put effort into learning them, whereas if I'm taking it from a language I know, or that I'm familiar with at least, even though it does take time to put them into a dictionary and like see how it's going to work in my language as opposed to the language I'm taking it from, there isn't this extra time to like attach it mentally to the concept, at least not as much, and so it feels like it's going faster. Even if it's not actually going faster, it feels like I'm making quicker progress, just because the act of doing the work is kind of happening simultaneously to the act of me learning it. They're happening at once, whereas when it's a priori, at least for the way that my brain works, I have to learn it. I have to like put them together, do the work, and then go back and study it because it's unfamiliar entirely. Whereas it's not entirely unfamiliar. I can put things together and then remember them based on the process of having put them together in my sheets or wherever I happen to be putting language together. So even though it could take the same amount of time to make an a priori versus an a posteriori language, it might even take more time depending on how I do the a posteriori. The work would feel harder subjectively, because I'd also be having to put in extra work to learn the language. This is just how my brain works. Other people have very different experiences. I know other people who make lots of a priori languages and do not have this problem whatsoever. But just in my experience of doing things, it does take me, at least, more time and work to do a priori languages. I've also liked a lot more of the a priori languages that I've made and learned them. Most of the languages that I've made that I know how to use pretty proficiently are a priori. There's maybe one or two a posteriori that I feel kind of confident in and don't need to look up in the dictionary as often. And that's just because of the immense amount of time I put into learning and using them, and making them in the first place, versus a posteriori, which the process could go a lot faster in making it, but I'm not spending as much time, so I don't end up learning it because I just can kind of toss it off really quickly, and not spend as much time. So that is a bit of a con. If it goes faster, a con of a posteriori could be quickly fatigue. Well, I mean, that could happen with a priori too if I'm fatigued by the aesthetic. That's why I made aesthetic less of a goal with this language, so that doesn't happen as much. But I guess quickly making the language could decrease time spent learning. Now, I doubt this is going to happen with this language just because I actually want to learn this language. I have motivation to do it because of the goal that I've made. I've made it a goal that I would actually want to use the Conlang for. So that could mitigate this con. But those are my pros and cons for a priori, with this language at least. Well, these kind of apply to most languages. I still make a lot of a priori despite these cons because I enjoy the pros of, making roots is fun and not being controlled or constrained by a source language. Now, the pros of a posteriori are basically the corollary to the cons of a priori. Unlike with a priori, where it's greater cognitive load because it's all unfamiliar roots that I'm having to make up myself, with a posteriori, I have something to grab on. If I'm picking a language I'm familiar with to base the language on, or languages I'm familiar with, then I am familiar with the roots and familiar with the language, and so it makes it easy to remember and learn because I can make associations with the languages I know. There might be cognates. If I borrow, let's say I'm not thinking of doing this necessarily, but let's say I take the language from Latin or something, there would be cognates with Romance languages I'm familiar with, like Italian or French or Spanish or something. So I can say, if I'm going to forget the word in this language for person, I would think, is it related to the Italian word for person? And that will help me remember it. And just the process of putting it together would be me learning that those are the cognates and making those associations as I do it. And that's what I meant when I said it takes less time, because the process of making the language is also the process of me learning the language, in large part. So that's kind of where we get into this one. Less work coming up with roots, because the roots exist in the language. I don't have to come up with them myself. I won't run out of creative steam if I get to, I need to make a word for mint, for example. I could take it from the source language, because like if I'm like, I can't think of a good root for mint that sounds minty, I can look up the root, or I might happen to know the root for that would be a good source for the word mint, and it's there. I didn't even have to come up with it myself. I just had to make it fit into my language's structure. And here I didn't actually finish this this thought, and I don't even remember what my thought was. I said more fun in something. I don't remember what I meant there. I think I was thinking making new roots is fun, but also deriving from existing languages is fun, especially if it is diachronic. I like to put words through sound changes. The only thing is then I have to remember the sound changes, which I usually don't have that much of a problem with. I might misorder them and make mistakes, but that actually happens in natural languages too. Different dialects will have shifts come in different order, and that's how different dialects come about, in part sometimes. So it could just be a dialectal variation or something, if I do happen to make a mistake. And it's my language, so I could just decide that that's what the language did. It made a kind of sporadic change that can happen sometimes. So I think that's what I meant there, is that it's fun. Just like it's fun to make new roots, it's also fun to derive from existing languages, because I like existing languages, just like I like making my own from scratch. So I think that's what I meant there. Fun to derive. And then there are, of course, the cons, which are basically the corollary to the pros of a priori. So the source languages could be limiting. So whereas a priori I'm not stuck, I'm not, constrained by what my sources are, especially because it's engineered and I want to make specific, maybe specific distinctions that no natural language really makes very well, or at least none of the ones that I would be getting it from. So I could be limited by that. Now, I don't have to be. I could maybe make exceptions to a posteriori and say, hey, if there's no good word for this, I get to make one up, and I just want to make up something that doesn't clash with an existing word. So I might want my sound system to allow for a lot of different sounds so that it doesn't clash, potentially. Or I could allow homophones. That's also a thing in natural languages. So I could always get around this con. I could say, well, if the source is limiting me, then I can kind of go out on a limb and make my own word. Or I could tweak what something means to be less limiting, potentially. And there's the other con of it going quickly, is that maybe because I can learn it as I make it, by the time I'm done making it, now I have no motivation to learn it and use it. Again, like I said before, I doubt that will happen with this language because I am very motivated to use this language. So this is less of an issue. So this could be mitigated. This feels like it's not going to be as much of an issue with this language. So these cons are not as strong. There is one more con I thought of while I was explaining this stuff. And the con of a source language, it kind of goes with being limiting, but I am limited by the source languages with which I'm familiar. And this is a con, I guess not of a posteriori, but of basing it on languages I know, which is that I don't know every language in the world, of course, and I want to be able to take notes on whatever language I happen to be studying, even if it's one I'm not familiar with, and different cultures, right? But if I'm picking from only languages I know, that is a big source of, I guess, bias in the language, where if I'm taking from languages I know, the kinds of distinctions they're going to make might not be as detailed as I want them to be, because they're limited to the languages I speak. And there might be concepts that my source languages can't express very well. Now, of course, in those situations, I could do what I said here and say, well, if that concept isn't expressed well in one of my languages, then I can kind of go out on a limb and make my own word for it. Or I could take it from a language that does make that distinction that isn't one of my main source languages. And in that case, I could have multiple source languages. I could have ones that I'm familiar with, and maybe some that I'm unfamiliar with, but do find that there is a good word for that concept. But the more I do that, the less these pros are in effect, because if I'm unfamiliar with it, then it might as well then be a priori. The only difference is I actually get a benefit out of it being a posteriori, like a side benefit, not inherent to the Conlang, but just to me, is that I learn a new word that does exist in a natural language. Even if it's one I'm unfamiliar with, I'm learning a new word that exists in a natural language that's out there in the world, versus learning a root I made up out of my own head. That doesn't really benefit me outside of the language. An example might be, I want to make a distinction between, I don't know, two concepts of, maybe two types of fabric. And it's a fabric, let's say my source languages are like Old English and Gothic and Old Church Slavonic or something, things that I have a little bit of experience with. Old Church Slavonic less so, but or maybe Romance is one of the sources, like Romance languages. Let's say those are my sources, and it's just the fabric I'm talking about. There is no word for it in any of those languages because it's a fabric that doesn't exist in that region of the world. I would be limited if I were stuck with those languages. Now, I could make up a word for that fabric just out of my own head. I don't really get a benefit from that. It exists in the language now. That's cool. Or whatever culture that has this fabric that I'm talking about, I could sort of make an exception and borrow the word from that culture and say, okay, in this fabric in my Conlang comes from the word for this in this culture that has a better word for it. And that works very well. I like doing that because now I've learned a new word in English and in whatever language that the fabric comes from. But it's not as familiar, so I'm not actually getting this pro as much. Maybe in general I am, but there are some exceptions where the only difference between it being a priori and not is just that the source is a real language and not my own made-up roots. But I kind of feel okay with that. I'm limited by the source language with which I'm familiar if I stick with them. So I could just not stick with them. I could, generally maybe get the words from languages I'm familiar with, but if there isn't a word for something, I could borrow it. That's if I take an a posteriori approach. Unless I allow borrowing outside of main source languages. Which I feel like I would do, because it's my Conlang. I can allow whatever I want. Now, again, I'm still not sure. I honestly still don't know which would be the better thing to do with this language, because it is an engineered goal. Like, I do have the goal of engineering it to be suited to these topics. I think there's one more pro and con that I could add to each, actually. One is that I intend for this language to describe like actual humanities that exist in the world, and using an a priori language for that, even though it is engineered to be sort of adept at doing so. If it's completely a priori, there's a part of me that feels like doing so makes it feel kind of sterile. And what I mean is that I'm talking about real-world humanities that exist in the world that I live in with a language that is completely, like, it's influenced by some things. Like, I've listed some influences on some of the concept, like some of the aspects of the grammar. It's influenced by real-world languages, but if all the roots are unique and coming straight from my brain, it feels kind of disconnected, like separate and hands-off from the actual world that I'm describing, the history, the cultures, the languages that I'm going to use this language to describe. So there's kind of a feeling of sterility if I'm making it a priori. It doesn't have to have that feeling, but that's just kind of a subconscious thing I feel a little bit that could be at play with a priori. Now on the flip side, a posteriori, and this kind of connects with some of the other cons, a posteriori feels like it is going to be inherently biased towards whichever languages I take from. Like if I choose real-world languages. Now, being unbiased is not one of my goals. It is partially a personal language. I'm going to be just using this language to take notes on and express ideas in these topics, but it's my point of view on these topics. And I am inherently biased by my own knowledge and experience. It potentially makes this language less interesting to other people if they wanted to learn it, if it's biased towards languages I know and not anyone else, or, concepts I have that not everyone else does. But my goal isn't to make this have a mass appeal. If other people like it, that's kind of their choice. The goal is for me to use it, and also to use it as a tool to explain my process in making conlangs. And that's kind of the benefit other people can have. If they don't want to learn it, they can maybe learn some stuff about linguistics and conlanging in the process of me making this language. So I'm not super... While I do feel like there's bias, inherent bias, in choosing languages to be the source, I don't think that's a problem for my goal. It could be problematic for part of my goal, in that it's engineered. I want it to be detailed and compact to convey information in the humanities and social sciences. And the humanities and social sciences already have a lot of implicit bias in how they're studied, who studies them, who has authority in these fields of academia, or even outside of academia. There's a lot of bias, and part of why I like studying these subjects is to have my biases challenged, and also reduce the bias I have by understanding these with more diverse perspectives than just my own, or the one that's been fed to me by the biased academia that I'm a part of. So that's sort of why I feel that maybe a posteriori has the potential for extra bias, just in the source of where my words and concepts are coming from. My concepts, though, the concepts themselves don't have to be limited. I had that as a con, that my sources could limit me, but the reason I italicize it is because this could cut down on the potential for familiarity, because I could create false cognates with this process, but I could have a concept in this language that I want to have mean something that is not with the same connotations that it has in the source language. It's really hard for me to think of a good concrete example for what I mean with this, but if there's a concept like if I'm talking about family structures that different cultures have, and I want vocabulary for that, if I'm taking from, say, the European languages with which I am most familiar as my base, they are equipped particularly to express in a detailed way European family dynamics. And there are lots of different kinds of family structures that exist in European-speaking cultures, but it's still limited to that sort of subcategory of existing family structures. And if I want a word for a kind of structure that doesn't exist in any of those cultures, I could, like I said earlier, I could borrow a word from outside of those source languages, or I could have my word in my language, even though it comes from a European language, not have the same meaning that it has in those European languages. It could be refer to a broader category in anthropology, and then I could further specify with other sort of modifiers or derivational affixes for the particular kind of structure it is. So what I'd be creating is maybe a false cognate, maybe in the language it comes from, it means this particular relationship, maybe a nephew or something, would be a familial relation. But I'm describing maybe something particularly specific, paternal nephew, nephew of your, or maybe, what's the word? I'm forgetting the word off the top of my head. I need to review this. But you're the child of your brother, your nephew through your brother. If a culture has a specific word for that, but there's no European root for that from one of my languages that I'm getting it from, what I could do is just borrow the word that means nephew, but have it mean something more specific. Or I could do the reverse. Maybe the word means like brother of your, or child of your brother in the source language, but I have it mean any kind of nephew relationship. And then in the specific language, in the specific scenario, I could have like a modifier or a suffix or something that specifies what kind of nephew. So I'd be creating a false cognate. Like in one language it means this very specific thing, and in my language it means something more generic, and that could be a problem for the association. Like it would still be associated, it could still help me remember it, but I'd have to remember that distinction when learning the Conlang. Or of course, like I said before, I could just borrow the more specific term that's used in the specific culture I'm borrowing it from. Now, I guess the kind of other challenge that comes with borrowing from a wide array of languages with the goal of being specific is that a lot can be lost in the borrowing process. And what I mean is, if my language has a particular sound system and the word in the source language is made up of sounds that my language does not have, I need to alter. In the process of borrowing, this is what happens with languages. When you borrow a word that's not from your language into your language, it retrofits itself just subconsciously. It's not an active choice. It retrofits itself to the sound system of your language to be pronounceable by the speakers. So it transforms into a borrowing that is now a word in the language that's borrowing it, and it's not the same as the source. But in the process, it changes pronunciation, and that could happen in my that would happen in my language if my language can't express a sound. Like maybe there's a tone that's being used, and if my language isn't tonal, then I lose the tone and therefore essential information in the source language that is not being expressed. Now, this could be less of a problem given the fact that this is a written language, so I could just write symbols that don't exist in my language that express the sound that doesn't exist because it's written. I'm not really constrained by pronounceability as much with this language. However, one of my goals is to be able to pronounce it, like speak the language and sound like I'm speaking it fluently. It's a side goal, but it is a goal. So I would need to have a very permissive, sound system. I'd need to have like maybe the majority of sounds that the majority of languages have be part of my language if this were the case, which is a lot. Languages can make a lot of different sounds. I have listed here on this sheet that we haven't gotten to. Not every possible sound, there's more possible sounds, but it's a lot of them. These are a lot of the consonants, and there are so many more consonants that are pronounceable, but lots of consonants, as many consonants and vowels as I could fit onto the sheet without making the rows and columns more complicated than Google Sheets can handle, because I would have to make it 3D in order to be completely comprehensive, and I can't do that on Google Sheets, to my knowledge. If there's a way to make it 3D, it would be hard to read anyway. So I made this as detailed as I possibly could, given my tools, and it's still not every sound in every language. There aren't any languages that have all of these sounds, but if I want to be able to borrow any word without altering it, I would have to have all of these sounds and maybe some more. I didn't even include click consonants here, or every kind of phonation for every consonant here. I just included a lot of the most common distinctions here. Even if I had all of these, it wouldn't be enough to be able to pronounce every single word as if it were a native word in this language. And I frankly don't want to have this many sounds in my language, but I still want to be able to pronounce it. So one thing that I have considered is actually deviating from the natural language, because it's engineered and I can do things that are natural, is because it's meant to include information about linguistics, that because it's intended for people who study social sciences, maybe people are just encouraged to do their best to actually pronounce it as if it weren't a word in the language. That might be a thing that I allow just in this language, simply because of the goal. Like, I can kind of make it not naturalistic in that way. I still don't like that. for the reason that I want to be able to describe things in this language. So I still need words that are native to the language that will describe the things that I'm then loaning in to say, like, this is the more specific word in the source language for XYZ thing that I need words in this language to describe. Which probably brings me back to a priori. But the other thing is, as detailed as I need to be, it will be a lot of work to come up with as many roots as I need for this language. A lot of work. It will be a lot of work to derive from languages too. But the way that this can kind of expedite the process, especially of learning it, with as detailed as I want to be, as much as engineered languages tend to be a priori, the more and more I think about it, the more and more I'm leaning towards having the language be a posteriori. And this, I think, what I want to talk about is different options I have with a posteriori. With a priori, it's very clear. I could either just make the language immediately from my own head, make all the roots, list out the roots that I'll need, or the concepts that I'll need words for, and start making them, just churning them out, churning out my language. Or I could make a list of just root concepts that I need, and then the grammar that I need, and derive it naturalistically with sound changes and grammar changes and stuff like that to give me the result that I want. Those are my two options with a priori, basically. I could even have it be a priori, but then still borrow words when if I run out of steam and get uncreative, I can allow myself to borrow some words, have some things that are coming from real languages, but still, for the most part, having it come out of my brain. That's a possibility, but that still means, a mental, a cognitive load of learning. Whereas with a posteriori, there is the sort of benefit of having familiarity with a lot of the words, even if some of them are borrowed from languages I don't know. And if I do that, I have the pro of now learning that word in the language I borrow it from. So I am starting to think that the pros of a posteriori outweigh the cons, and I would just want to think of ways to overcome the cons. Whereas a priori, the cons feel a lot for the kind of goal I have, despite how much it seems like the natural choice for an engineered language. It's the kind of engineered language that's really motivating my choice here. It's a language meant for describing the real world, real languages, real cultures. And I want to be able to learn it quickly. I want to be able to make associations with the languages I'm using to describe it with. So I'm going to say that I want the language to be a posteriori. That's kind of my tentative choice here. But I think what I need to do is decide what kind of a posteriori, because there are some different options I want to talk about. But before I do that, I actually do need to take a couple minutes of break to go check on something. But I will be back very quickly. Thank you, chat, for hanging in there. I really appreciate everyone who's here. And if there are any questions that come up in the meantime about my sourcing, I actually might not stay on the Be Right Back page. I might stay on this sourcing page, just so that maybe if people in the chat want to think about it and ask questions about it, then they can. And then I can maybe answer those when I come back. So I think I will just be gone for about 3 minutes, maybe even less. But I'm going to say tentatively I'll be back like 2040 PST. If it wants to type, that is. Why didn't it type? Oh, because the text is white here. That's why. I don't know why that. Oh, I was trying to make the column separators white is why, and I accidentally pressed the text. Whoops. Okay. Yeah, that's about the time I'll be back. Thank you, everyone in the chat. I will be right back. audio a little bit lower right now than I usually have it. I am very quiet. Okay, good. I'm going to make it a little bit louder. How is this? Better. Okay, I'll make it a little bit higher. So I was a couple minutes over. More normal. Okay, so the reason I have it a little bit lower is because the stream had to be a bit later tonight. I'm having dinner now, so I don't want my chewing sounds to be particularly loud, but I do need to eat a bit. So I will be doing that. A little bit. I might take a couple more short breaks just to take a bite of food. But I see some comments in the chat while I was gone. Let's see. Oh, the royalty-free music. Someone used it in a game that they made. That's really cool. Yeah, I just found this music on a site that had royalty-free music. So we must have used the same site, or just happened to have the same song. That's really cool. Yeah, I think this was just called like medieval tavern music, or something to that effect. I'm curious what the game was. But, alright, let's get back into things. So we have what I landed on before this short break was that I would like to have, it was the Talking to Scammers game. Oh, cool. Okay, I know what you're talking about. That's cool. I will need to replay that. Okay, so people watching in the future might not have context for this, but fun to derive, just like my car. Yeah, fun to drive. Yes. It will be fun to drive this language too, hopefully. That's one of my goals, is I want to be able to drive this language pretty easily. As someone who does not drive, that's extra funny to me. But let's see. So I landed on wanting this language to probably be a posteriori, despite all of the factors that make engineered languages tend to be a priori. I think in this particular instance, the goals of this language, with how social and the fact that it's about humanities, and I'm going to use it to talk about real languages and cultures, makes me lean more towards having the words come from real languages. So I want to talk about different approaches I could take here. I'm going to merge the cells too, here, from here on out. So I have a few different options. I could take it from I could take it from one language and just derive it. One language and derive it from and I could derive it with sound change. And what that means is that I take a language and I just put the language through changes, naturalistic changes, like the kind that happen to real languages, to make a descendant language. Now, purely doing this does not seem like it, like I've done this before for Conlangs. Like I've taken, for example, Gothic or Old English, or most often I take like Proto-Indo-European or something, or Proto-Semitic, and I put it through sound changes to make a hypothetical daughter language for it. Kind of like an alt-lang, like if there was a descendant language of this language that also existed, here's what it would be, that went through these changes. And I've done that before. But for this particular language, that doesn't seem like it makes very much sense. Because, well, my goal is to, my goal is to have things be specific and able to talk about different humanities topics. And I don't think any one language is going to give me everything I need for that. And just picking one language feels extra leaning into this bias. I wouldn't just be limited by the source languages. I know I would be limited to the one language that I'm using. Even if I allow borrowings, for the most part, my vocabulary would come from one language and be limited to that language's sort of the available roots in that language, even if I kind of slightly tweak their meaning to fit my goal better. So this feels like it's probably a no. I feel weird crossing it out, but I will cross it out just to express that it's probably a no. I can always undo it. I could also take it from one language. Well, the other option is to take it from one language but not derive it from sound change, but just tweak it to my needs, like the sound, as if I were borrowing the words, and it was just every word was borrowed from that one language. That's another option, but it has the same issue of the one language thing, so it's also probably a no. I could do, then we have kind of the same two options, but with multiple languages. I could have it borrowed from multiple languages, and derive with sound change. So what that would mean is, like, for each donor language, I have rules for what sounds change, so that it can then fit into the phonology of my language. So I have particular rules for each language. So I'd have to remember, here, I just have to remember what changes happen from my source language to my language. Here, I would have to remember a different set of sound changes for each source language, which feels very impractical. So that's probably also going to be a no. I could make this practical, but I don't see it being an easy process, and that just feels like too much to ask for. And then, of course, I could just do multiple languages and then tweak to my phonology. Of course, all of these also involve tweaking the meanings so that it can fit my goals more clearly than, like, languages that I'm getting from aren't engineered to my goals in the way that this language will be. So I will always have to kind of tweak meanings a bit. But multiple language tweak to phonology kind of is as if I'm borrowing rather than just deriving naturalistically. It's like I'm borrowing, like, if you were imagining a hypothetical culture speaking this, they just borrowed words from whichever of these languages. Like, they came into contact with speakers of the languages and borrowed them, so much so that it just replaced any words they originally had. But they were fitted to the sound system that they had. There just wouldn't be any original words. Or there might be some, if I have any a priori situations where none of my source languages are cutting it, and there's no word in a different language I could borrow it from, I might just need to make up a root. So that's a possibility. Multiple languages tweak to phonology, as if I'm borrowing from multiple. And I'm trying to think if there are any options that I'm forgetting. I guess hybrid approaches between these. I could have one language I derive from, but multiple that I tweak from and borrow from regularly, to the point where they kind of have equal representation in the language. It's just one is like the main descended from, like, it's descended from this language, but it borrows heavily from these others, and then occasionally borrows from ones that aren't included in those others. But any of these one options, even mixed ones, still feel like too much for me. I want it to kind of be evened out between the different source languages, because it's already biased to the languages I want. I don't want it to be biased to just one of the languages that I know, necessarily. So if I do go with this option, and then of course there's hybrids between these options and a priori. You know, I could borrow from multiple languages and also extensively make up my own roots as well. That's also an option. But the more I make up my own roots, the more the cognitive load gets weighed with, like, a bunch of unfamiliar roots that don't really have any practical use in the real world. Like, the practical use would be for me to use for my own notes, which is the goal of this whole language, but I don't get any kind of side benefits. Whereas if I borrow from real languages, the side benefit is I've now learned that word from the real language, even if it's one I don't already know. So I think I would prefer to have it be a posteriori, not just because it expedites the process of making the language, and I'm not worried about the potential downside of that being me not learning it, because I want to learn it either way. I will push myself to learn it. But it not only expedites the process, it has the side benefit of just me learning more. The process of making this language will be a learning opportunity, not just for people watching this stream learning how I make conlangs, and learning about some of the linguistic topics I'm covering, but also it will be a benefit to me learning the new words in some of the languages that I might be borrowing from that I'm not familiar with. So even if it is a potential con in terms of I don't have the association, I can build a new association. And rather than having a new association that's just coming out of thin air, it's a new association that might be useful in the real world because it's a real language that people speak. That's kind of the benefit there. So I think the way to go is to do multiple languages and borrow the words from the multiple languages so that I don't have to think of sound changes to derive them from. So what I need then, the sort of steps then, are to choose source languages, and I need to make a phonology, a sound system that will capture maybe the sounds that a lot of these source languages will have to the point where they won't be too unrecognizable. They will have to be tweaked a bit to fit into my sound system, but I don't want them to be too unrecognizable, so I might need enough sounds so that the source languages are represented. But the other thing that I need to think about is how many sounds I need based on my ideas for grammar. And this is why I waited on the phonology until after I talked about all the grammar, because I wanted to think of how many distinctions I needed. Because if you remember back to like nouns and cases and verbs, but particularly nouns and the cases, the declension, for example, I was thinking about how if we look at these declension tables, come on, look. I have these 8 currently. I'm still hemming and hawing about whether or not I want to separate animals and other humans from each other again, like they were before. At one point we had fauna and we had humans. I merged them into just animate animals, like humans and animals. I merged them into one category. I might unmerge them. I still need to do some more tests to see whether or not I need that in this language or not, but I need to have them be grammatically distinct, because they will be distinct in terms of words. But do I need separate pronouns to refer to animals versus referring to humans? That's something I need to do some more tests on. But in any case, I have these different, like 8 to 9 noun classes, and I wanted to differentiate them potentially by, I wanted to differentiate the noun classes by maybe a combination of vowel and consonant. And I think what I was saying was I also wanted my cases to be differentiated by consonant endings. So I would need 6 legal consonants that can go at ends of words, that sound nice at the ends of words, that I like the sound of, that will differentiate these different cases. Because, and the reason I wanted them to be consonants is because a lot of my verb endings might also be vowel final, and my verbs need to mark case too when I have noun clauses, and that's what we talked about with noun clauses. They must be able to mark for case. So my case markings that I put on nouns need to also be attachable to verbs somehow. So that's something to keep in mind with my phonology. I need to make sure I have enough consonants and vowels to differentiate all these different things like irrealis, perfective, imperfective, my direct and indirect evidentiality. I need to think about that with my phonology. But my phonology now also needs to be able to handle at least the most distinct parts of the words that are in the languages I'm getting words from. So that's the phonology bit. Be able to capture enough distinctions made in sources. It doesn't have to capture all the distinctions. Maybe my source language uses a tone and I don't capture that tone. That might be important to have, though. If it's tonal language, the tone is really important. But maybe it's something like aspiration and my language doesn't capture that, because I have multiple languages I can choose from, and then it's less of an issue because I won't be borrowing both like minimal pairs from each other and from the same language. I would probably choose different words from different languages. And enough for grammar. I wanted to have enough sounds to distinguish different grammatical things in my language, and that's why I talked about grammar first. Now with source languages, I need to choose languages either that I'm familiar with or that I want to learn, because the process of me making this language can also be the process of me making associations between the concepts I'm using and the words in the language. So I don't have to be super familiar with the language. I just need to be familiar enough that I can learn it and use it. So choosing source languages, languages I'm familiar with, and I'll just do a W here, with, and am learning. So I can make a list of potential options for this that would work particularly well for my goals. So this is where we're at with a priori and a posteriori. So I think I'm going to go with an a posteriori language that comes from multiple languages, where I am borrowing the words rather than deriving them naturally, as if this language is descended from all of them somehow. I'm going to borrow them in, as if it would be kind of more like a creole. That is a particularly loaded word politically, but when I use that word, I mean it in its linguistic, like its sociolinguistic use, which generally means it's a language that is derived from a pidgin that has grammaticalized because there are native speakers who speak it. It's a little bit more complicated than that. I feel bad reducing it in that way. There's a lot of research I can maybe link in the description of the YouTube video once this goes up on this sort of topic, because it does get very complicated. But what I mean is that these kinds of languages, I guess the most linguistically neutral term I could use is blended language, or that's still not politically neutral, of course, but mixed language is another word that gets used by linguists, is where you have, rather than a language that derives from one single ancestor, you have a language that derives from contact between speakers of different languages. And so words and grammar structures from both languages will kind of come together in this new language, and they will create a new language, basically. And the stage where you're just people are coming into contact with each other and trying to communicate with their words is usually called a pidgin by sociolinguists. It's maybe not the best term. I think we could come up with more neutral terms for it. And then once that language becomes a native language that like children learn and acquire, it takes on sort of more systematized grammatical features that make it what sociolinguists tend to call creole. In the actual places where this happens, both of those words tend to be used very differently than sociolinguists use them, and they are often charged with like value judgments that are not what the words that linguists are using are trying to capture exactly. So I'm trying to be careful with the words I'm using here. But the reason I'm making this comparison is basically what I would be doing is almost as if that were happening, as if the multiple languages that I'm taking words from are kind of coming together and creating a new language from that coalescence. So it's not going to be, at least the way I want to do it, it's not going to be as if one of the languages is the main language and it's just borrowing from these other languages. Often there's what's called a super straight language in these kind of language contact results. Often these languages are coming out of a colonial context where like the colonizer language is the super straight and it's given more prestige. And the languages it's coming into contact with are not given as much prestige, but they might contribute substantially to the language still. I don't want to replicate that particular scenario. I would want kind of to have a balance between my source languages. But the point is, my language will not particularly be the descendant of any one of them. It's kind of all of them contributing to this language. Because I am engineering it. It is not coming about naturally. I am making it with a particular goal in mind. So it's kind of like a language contact situation, except it's not a real-world language contact situation. I am putting these languages into contact theoretically in my brain as I make the language. So I'm going to choose source languages that I think could particularly work for this language, for my goals. I want to indent this. I'll just put spaces. Not an easy way to indent on Google Sheets, but I guess this is my decision here with where the language is going to come from. So between now and next time, I think what I'll do is I will list the languages that I want to potentially take it from, and then what we'll do next time is think about, well, actually, we still have 27 minutes, technically, so we could start thinking about the languages now. But the next item I put was root shape. What shape I want my roots to take. But maybe that isn't what I should do, because I don't know what sounds I want. Root shape. I'm trying to remember the reason I had this coming next after sourcing. We can cover root shape. I'm just trying to think about why. Oh. I remember. Okay. So, the reason I had root shape here is because the next thing I want to talk about after that is phonotactics, which is sort of how sounds are allowed to kind of be structured in syllables, or if I don't sort of think of my language in terms of syllables, whatever other structure I put them in. But this is about the structures that sounds are allowed to come into. And the reason I want to do this before I actually choose which consonants and vowels I have is because I want to know how many, for example, coda consonants I want to allow, or onset consonants I want to allow in the language based on what my constraints need to be. My constraints, my sort of limitations on where sounds can come, that's kind of what phonotactics is about, will depend on what shape my roots and my affixes need to be. So when I say root shape, I also mean things that aren't roots, like suffixes, prefixes, infixes, etc. So I will talk about root shape. So what I had discussed before was that I mostly wanted one of my goals is easy derivation between parts of speech. That's what POS stands for, parts of speech. I want to easily go from one part of speech to the other. And that's especially important given the way that I'm doing adjectives and nouns in this language. Adjectives are verbs. So if I make an adjective out of a noun, what I do is I turn the noun into a verb and then conjugate that verb. And if I want to make a verb into a noun, I add one of my class endings to give that noun a gender, whether it be human, or I guess right now it's human or animal, supernatural, phenomenon, concept, whatever. So that's how I turn a noun into a verb into a noun. So the way that those are going to be structured, as I was saying with declension, I was thinking I would have a root, and then, well, okay, it depends on how I'm doing my verbs too. Because I was thinking, and I think this is just the way I tend to make languages, and maybe I don't have to make it this way. A lot of the languages I work with tend to have roots that end with consonants, because I think I talked about wanting these to be suffixes. So if I have roots that end in consonants, then most of my, so if my default is perfective, then it's just going to end in a consonant, and that's going to show that the verb is perfective and it has direct evidentiality. And then all these other things are going to be vowels that I can add. Oh, someone's signing off of the chat. Thank you. Have a good rest of your night. So, let's see here. So I have, so if my zero ending is just truly nothing, if my unmarked ending is just nothing, then it can just be a consonant. Oh, but it cannot be. Because it cannot be if my cases are consonants, if my case ending, because I need to be able to put case endings on it, right? That's one of the things. If my case endings are purely consonants, either I need a vowel that can like kind of come in between the root and the case ending, or I don't have verbs end in. I don't have verbs, or I maybe allow a sort of optional, like a vowel comes in if there's a case ending there that's not patientive. But otherwise, I have different vowels, or maybe there is a default vowel, and then I have other vowels that mark the other sort of aspect, evidentiality, mood stuff. So, and then you just add case endings to that. And then since my roots would end in consonants, for declension, my roots already end in consonants, but then what I was thinking, and I talked about this last time, there would be specific vowels associated with these different classes, but I don't have to have 8 or 9 vowels necessarily. That's a lot. I mean, I speak languages with more than that, more vowels than that, but I don't necessarily want to distinguish that many, especially depending on what my source languages are. They might not even have that many, and I have to like come up with them out of whole cloth. But what I was thinking is I would have a consonant-vowel combo, so that can allow me to have fewer vowels that I need to differentiate between these classes. So maybe like for the first 3, the vowel is one thing, but the consonants are different. And then for the next 3, it's a different vowel, maybe the consonants are different. But what this would mean is if my roots end in consonants, then the consonants that the noun class endings begin with need to be ones that can come in clusters with the consonants that end my root. And I don't want to limit how many verb roots I'm allowed to have, because most of the roots in this language will be coming from verbs. So I want to have as many as I want. So what I would want to have is clusters. I would want to have the kinds of consonants here that I would be fine having be cluster consonants that can come after any consonant, which it would really depend on the aesthetic I'm going for with this language, but that might become pretty limiting. Now, there is an alternative to this, which is that I don't have verb roots end in consonants. I could have verb roots just inherently end in vowels. They just always end in a vowel, and whatever vowel it ends with, that's the perfective. It could be different vowels. It could have basically different classes of verb, like conjugations, based on whatever vowel it ends with. And then the other sort of aspect, mood, evidentiality ending will add another consonant, but they'll still also need to add another vowel to take the case ending if the case endings are consonants, which, if my case endings are vowels, I will need 7 vowels, basically. 6 or 7 vowels distinguished. And I don't like the idea of having my cases be purely vowels, just because some vowels can sound pretty similar when they're not, whoa, sorry for the noise, when they're not the stressed syllable. So, I probably would want, if my roots are ending in vowels, final, then my suffixes for these different aspects and moods will need to contain a consonant and a vowel so that it can then take the consonant of the case if it's a noun clause. So I might want my roots to be vowel final. Now, if my roots are vowel final, then how does that impact my genders here, my noun classes? Well, I could still do consonants and vowels. I still need these things to end in vowels so that I can add the case endings to them. So these also need to end in vowels. However, I'm more free with what consonants can begin the sort of class ending, because there's going to be a vowel before it. So I'm not having to worry about like awkward sounding clusters, because there's always going to be a vowel before it. If all of my verb roots end in vowels, then my consonants can be whatever I want them to be. I would just need there to be a consonant between the ending, because if I just choose a vowel for one of these classes, it would need to be a vowel that does not show up as a verb root ending, because I don't want it to be ambiguous with a perfective direct evidentiality root, or if I still haven't made the decision about imperfective or perfective as the default. I still need to do those tests I was talking about last time, about which one will be more frequent depending on what I'm writing about. And the tests I'll probably show next time are just me, thinking about the kinds of topics I would use in this language and translating them, not into the language because I don't have words yet, but basically writing out how they would parse, like what the root would be, what kind of case it would be in if I were to like transform that sentence. And trying to see so for example, with the animates, if I'm going to do human versus fauna, or if I'm just going to keep them in one, I'm thinking, how much do I need to know that this animate is a person versus not a person? And with this issue of which is marked, which is unmarked, just which one is coming up more when I'm writing about history, anthropology, sociology, etc. So I just need to do more practice examples I just need to find random texts that I might be writing about in those topics and parse them into this language's structure and see which ones come up more, because whichever one comes up the most that I feel like will be the most common, that's the one I'm going to have be unmarked. So it might turn out that it's going to be imperfective instead of perfective. But in any case, if my verb roots are ending in vowels, then I wouldn't want any of my declensions to just be a vowel. I would want it to be a consonant than a vowel. And what this then means is the majority of my nouns are longer than my verbs. My verbs will be, unless there's derivation on the verb, my verbs will tend to be the shorter words in the sentence, which I kind of like. It kind of shows where the sort of sentence hinges, wherever the verb is. So it's kind of nice to have that be the shortest word. It's kind of like the main, like what is happening is this like short word that marks the evidentiality and mood and stuff. And then the rest of the content is a little bit longer because it's going to be more detailed anyway. That's what I want to be detailed. Sometimes my verbs will need to be detailed and they'll have markers on it, which will make them longer. But I'm fine in general with having nouns be longer than verbs. So in terms of root shape, and I'm just going to write it here on overview because I don't have a sheet for it yet, but I'm going to say roots need to be vowel final roots. I could put this in features, actually, not in goals. Vowel final verb roots. And I already know that most of my roots will be verbal. Any of my nouns needs to be able to become a verb by losing its class ending. The process of becoming a verb means losing its gender, because the gender is particular to the noun. Now that might be a problem if I want to differentiate different nouns of being that different class, but I might have a way of adding to the class rather than getting rid of it for certain kinds of verbs. I might have different verb classes based on derivation. I kind of think that makes natural sense. I would just need like a derivational morpheme that can turn a noun into a verb, and vice versa, because I want easy derivation between parts of speech. If it's in general, getting rid of the class for like the generic meaning of that concept, that works the best for me. But if there are situations where I need the class to be preserved in the verb itself, then I would also want a strategy for that. And I'll write that actually here so I don't forget that. Both deriving verbs from nouns, or, well, the root would be the verb, is actually, like, the verb would mean to be that noun concept. It just wouldn't be a particular gender, like concept or phenomenon. Nouns have a bare verb root and can verbify / adjectivify, because adjectives are verbs in this language, by losing its class ending. However, I don't need the however, just also there is derivation that can preserve the class when verbifying. And what I mean is like verbs that mean like to be this phenomenon, or to be the person X. If the root already means the person X, then I don't need to keep the human gender ending on it. But if the word means to be human and there's a different noun of a different class that means something kind of distinct that I don't want to be confused with, then that's a situation where I'd want to keep the class. And those might come up later. I might look at some examples of that between now and next time. So that is my derivation question. So the language is going to be a posteriori based on multiple languages. I'm going to write that. Multiple language sources. Okay, borrowed, not derived, but borrowed words borrowed from multiple language sources. The additional fun thing here that I didn't put is it is fun to derive, but I'm not deriving, I'm borrowing. The fun thing with borrowing is making the etymological dictionary for me. I love etymology. It's something I've actually done work in, is like putting together etymological resources. It's fun to have a dictionary and like have a column where you say where the word comes from. That's really fun to me. So that's also a source of fun that could be a pro to the a posteriori strategy I'm going with. So what I need to do is with sourcing, I probably need to make a new sheet that is my source languages and like the pros and cons of using those. So I probably need to do like a part 2. I've kind of decided a little bit of my root shape. I don't know what kinds of prefixes I might need, but I kind of want to leave the beginnings of words free, like whether they begin with consonants or vowels. I kind of want most of my roots to be bisyllabic. We'll talk about syllables next time, though, when we talk about phonotactics. Because I want to think about the vibe I want this language to have, but I can't do that until I'm done with sourcing. So I think I'm done with the sourcing I wanted to talk about in terms of like deciding whether the language is a priori or a posteriori. But the other kind of sourcing, which I didn't anticipate just because I didn't know whether the language would be a priori or a posteriori, but the second half of sourcing is what languages does it come from if it comes from languages. So that's the next sourcing question. Then we can kind of, I don't think there's much more to discuss with root shape, honestly, actually. I just needed to determine what roots would end with, because I talked about, when I talked about my declension in verbs, what I wanted the verb endings to be and the noun endings to be. But so long as that's clear, I need to actually write that then. On nouns, it's not going to be a noun, it's going to be a declension. Nouns just to summarize what the nouns would be. So, classes endings are, oh no, I don't want that there. Why is that happening? I'm just going to say class. I'm going to say derivational, and then consonant vowel, and then cases end with a consonant, and they need to be a nice sounding coda consonant. Coda just means end of syllable consonant, or just end of syllable sound usually. Coda is a consonant, not a vowel. It could be a semi-vowel though, which is a type of consonant. Now on verbs, I just need to also mark that verbs, I think I already did this, but I just want to check that I've done so. Yeah, roots are verb final. These markers are going to be consonant final, consonant vowel, so that they can allow for those consonant final case endings. So we want to be able to add a consonant onto the end of the suffix to say what case it has. If it's a noun clause, like if it's the goal of the other verb, or if it's the cause of the other verb, we want to be able to mark that with the case that indicates that, which is why we need the case endings here, because we decided we'd do that when we were doing our syntax. So that's basically the main root shape issue, which will inform our phonotactics next time. So we can call root shape done. We'll say it's done. And what we need to do next time, before we get into phonotactics even, whoa, I didn't want the whole sheet to be that. There we go. I just wanted this one row to be. No, why is this happening? Oh, I see why. I highlighted the wrong thing. I just want this to be the same. There we go. And I want to check because I finished root shape. That was really, really simple. The next thing is sourcing again. So what I'll say is sourcing 1, which is a priori, a posteriori. Sourcing 2 is what sourcelings am I using? I'll say which to be more specific. Which sourcelings am I going to have? Where are the words going to come from? I know they're going to come from real languages and not my own head. That's what we decided today. But what languages will they come from? And I think those parameters that we listed on sourcing were languages. There were 2 sort of types of sourcelings. Languages I'm familiar with, and languages I'm learning / want to learn. So these are kind of personal, because this is partially a personal language. That's one of the subcategories of languages. It's an engineered personal conlang, so this will be personal, and it will introduce some bias into the vocabulary. But the vocabulary was already going to be biased anyway, given my goal of it being sort of my understanding of these concepts, because I'm the one taking notes. So there will be some bias in the vocabulary anyway. It does add a little bit more than if it were I don't think it being a priori actually eliminates the bias. It's still biased towards my own understanding of things. It's just having it come from source language at least diversifies it from just my own brain, and it at least is getting the ideas from whatever languages I'm getting it from. And I want to think about different strategies as well for choosing source langs as well, because I'm starting with languages I know and I'm familiar with, and what I want to learn. But I want to look at what some other languages that take this a posteriori approach have done, and maybe think about how, if I want to do it in a similar way or not. So I want to look at, I'll bring in next time some languages that have done this kind of thing and compare it to what I want to do. So that is what I will do next time. I will, of course, we need to start with a review next time. And review is going to be, I guess, I still need to do these tests that I was talking about. I need to do more of them at least. So hopefully by next time, which will be Thursday, from 5 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. Pacific, I'll bring in these, and then I also am going to bring in other multi-lang sourced a posteriori languages. And then we'll start by looking at the list that I make of languages that I'm familiar with and languages that I am learning and want to learn. And seeing which of those, which ones will I want to have be the sources of this particular language based on my goals and such. So that, I believe, is all I have for today. We're ending a little bit early, but I also had to take a bit of a break earlier today, earlier in the stream. But I will wait maybe 10 seconds to see if there's any questions in the chat before I leave. But then I'm going to sign off. Thank you, everyone who made it tonight to the stream and participated in the chat, asking questions or just interacting. I really appreciate it. If anyone has any questions, feel free to contact me. I have some contact information on my Twitch, and it should be in my YouTube as well. My YouTube channel is now up to date with the last stream that happened yesterday. There is a link to the YouTube channel on Twitch. And then, in the meantime, I will just give a quick update. So, like I said earlier, the next Conlang with me will be Thursday from 5 to 7:30 p.m. Pacific. Then Yesterlore will be Friday from 5:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. Pacific, when we'll be doing, looking at some Anglo-Saxon legal material. It's not nearly as boring as it sounds. It'll just be really fun learning about the way that certain communities were structured. And this time for Saturdays is kind of in flux. The last couple weeks we did 3:30 to 7 Pacific. Tonight we did 6:30 to 9:30 Pacific. I don't know if it's going to stay at this time or if it's going to change. It's a little fluid right now, but my schedule on Twitch will be updated for that as soon as I know. But anyway, thank you, everyone. And if you're watching this in the future, I hope you enjoyed this or got something out of seeing me ramble on and think through these concepts as I make decisions about this Conlang. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their evening, day, afternoon, whatever time it happens to be when you're viewing this. Thank you so much, and goodbye.